property is going to end in this Malthusian tragedy, because the other key figure is Parson Malthus, the founder of demography and statistics, the discipline of demography, and really the discourse of poverty. So this is, again, channeling Ignacio, this is the common sense that we live in, right? Scarcity, the world of scarcity. And this figures in to environmental discourse in a profound way, and in a way that, of course, many environmentalists and ecologists are not necessarily aware of. Many times we hear of tragedy of the commons, or maybe even carrying capacity. And it fits our common sense, even though in fact it's often an assertion. According to Nate Sayre at Berkeley Geography, there's no evidence that there's this carrying capacity is not a scientific term. So we have to be very careful when we hear that scarcity is the limit term of what our demands can be and what our imagination can be. And as David Harvey often points out, there's a capitalism as sort of on a pendulum swing between cornucopianism on the one hand, which is there's enough, we just keep on growing excessively, and then this Malthusian trap on the other, which means, of course, austerity, which means, of course, we all have to tighten our belts, which is what we're doing, except we know that not everybody's doing that, right? But the logic of the tragedy of the commons is so powerful that we have to be suspicious of, for example, peak oil, a discourse like that, which is very popular amongst environmentalists and sectors of the left as well. What's going on with that? So those are some.
There was a question for Norman that I think goes. George, you have anything to add?
Point.
Yes.
If Garrett Hardin had Swiss cheese in his refrigerator and asked himself the question, how did it get there? If it was Swiss cheese imported from Switzerland, it would have gotten there because it came from the milk of cows that had been grazing on fields that were commons. Those fields were up in the Alpine peaks, and the Alpine peak areas where the cattle would go in the summer were in areas that were not owned by anyone and were actually managed by the dairy farmers themselves, who would bring their cattle, their cows up to the mountains and have agreed upon how many cows there would be and how many and where they would be grazing. These agreements were the foundation of the way in which commons work. And in this particular case, the result of this effort of commoning was a commodity, actually. So we actually discovered that in commons, many times the results of the commons work is basically the creation of commodities for a market.
Anybody else?
And the more you use it, the more productive it gets. So there are different logics, I guess, when you think about different parts of commons.
One specifically for Norman, a question about the Roma, and Roma as commoners or victims. So in the way, for the person who asked, it wasn't exactly clear. Do you think of Romani people as people who are commoners, who are escaping enclosures, who are able to escape, get away, so to speak? Or do you see them exclusively as victims?
I'm not an expert on Roma culture. I'm not an expert in Roma history or Roma tradition, Roma politics. What I noticed, what I saw, what I experienced, what I deduced was Roma are escaping persecution, systemic persecution, and they, in terms of being forced to wander, which is the common stereotype of Roma people, they would rather just stay put and have ordinary lives like ordinary people, have a place to call home, have a piece of land to share among themselves. They're commoners in they share among the culture as I understand it. There's so much sharing within the refugee camps. They have so little to share, but they share everything they have. That's part of the culture. But in terms of they're victimized, obviously they're survivors. They're being victimized, but they're incredible survivors. They've been forced to survive after centuries of persecution. And that's what I'm noticing. is wherever they are, they know how to live off the land as well. And this is what people would tell me, Roma people would tell me. They know how to live off the land. If you put a Roma child next to an American kid of the same age and put them in the woods, I mean, the Roma child would know how to survive, being taught skills, you know, by the family. But does that answer your question, whoever you are? I'll leave it there. You want to say something?
Norman, I did. I wanted to thank you and to add my welcome, you know, to your presentation. And I wanted to say that the presentation that Norman gave us, I think, is deeply important for American history, because the first racial legislation in Anglo law of the 1490s, and then at the time of the Tudors, you know, Queen Elizabeth I and Henry VIII, was against the Roma people. Capital punishment, or it was a capital crime to be a Roma person. And that was on the books until the middle of the 16th century. So subsequent racial persecution in European history derives from this attempt at genocide in England.
It's ongoing today. Everybody knows Roma were slaves in Romania until the 1860s, and slaves in America were freed when? 1867?
65.
65. In Romania, it was 1867. Roma were actually freed. Up until that time, they were chained, they were bound, they were killed, they were abused, they were sacrificed, they were treated as non-people. And it was only till 1867, 2 years after the United States freed slaves, that Romanian slaves became free. So-called.
So-called, yeah. We'll stick with that.
Thank you, Peter.
There's a hand up there. You want to add something?
If it's related.
Follow up, Peter. Curious about what precipitated the racial discrimination laws against Romani in England.
I think 1493 is the first Scottish statutes against the Roma people. The persecution of the Romans cannot be separated from the expropriation of the commons, the dissolution of the monasteries under the reign of the great hater of women, Henry VIII, when the English state was organized to create a vast population of vagabonds, beggars, sturdy rogues, which have passed down through history in the comic mode. But once you begin to study that, you will see it's deeply bloody-minded, and the treatment of the Roma is an essential part of it. Much of English jargon, Ebonics, comes from the Roma people. It has Latin, Gypsy, to use the language at that time, and slang. So as a big part of English culture, indirectly, this experience of the Roma, because yes.
I wonder also how this was connected to, because 1493 is also the big